I'd like to let our audience know that we are presenting today's webinar under Chatham House rule. AAFA is the largest trade association in the United States representing apparel and footwear brands, retailers, wholesale companies, and the supplier community, all of whom produce and distribute across global markets. Focusing on three core areas critical to the business operations of our industry: brand protection, supply chain and manufacturing, and trade, AAFA provides members with expertise across these disciplines to help members navigate the complex global marketplace. With unparalleled access to personalized casework, thought leadership, and unique resources and tools, AAFA is united through its mission: advocacy that fits. A quick technical note as we get started. We encourage everyone to participate and ask questions throughout the presentation. Please type your questions into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. They will be answered during the Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. We are also recording today's webinar, and it'll be available for download on AAFA's Learning Center, along with the presentation deck within 48 hours. If you experience any technical difficulties throughout the presentation, please contact GoToWebinar support at 1-800-263-6317. Presenting today from RAP, we have Audits Safarian, who's President and CEO, and Mark Jager, who is Vice President of Stakeholder Engagement. Audits joined RAP in 2004 and became its President and CEO in 2012. He has extensive knowledge of social responsibility issues within the highly complex worldwide supply chains of the apparel, textile, and footwear sectors. As Vice President for Stakeholder Engagement, Mark Jager is responsible for engaging with RAP's wide range of stakeholders and furthering the organization's position as the world's largest independent facility certification program focused on the apparel, footwear, and sewn product sectors. The three key learning objectives that we will cover today include indicators of forced labor and supply chains, including new indicators, best practices regarding supply chain due diligence when it comes to forced labor and security, and steps your company should take now to reduce the risk of a withhold release order. And with that, Audits, let's begin.
Okay, thank you very much, Nate. This really is a complicated topic, and we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'll get right to it. I'm going to briefly lay out the agenda for the webinar, and it'll start with, as I said, a short introduction to the issue and to the AAFA RAP guidance to understand and eradicate forced labor document that is being launched as part of this webinar. We'll talk about forced labor, the definitions of it, and the various laws that are applicable. Look at where forced labor will present itself in our supply chains, and then talk, as Nate indicated, a little bit about best practices and what we recommend buyers to engage in with regards to addressing forced labor from a policy perspective, as well as from a practice perspective. And then specifically the nuts and bolts of handling allegations of forced labor that you might encounter in the course of your business. Our hope is to save plenty of time for Q&A at the end, because we know this is the kind of topic that all of us are grappling with. We're very fortunate to have over 170 people in attendance, it looks like, and still climbing. And I know many of you are quite well steeped and experts in this area to begin with. So as Nate indicated, we are going to be holding this webinar under the Chatham House rule to allow for robust discussion. All the information you receive is yours to share and disseminate without attribution to individual people who ask questions or raise points. Okay, so very briefly, as I mentioned, this webinar is basically launching the publication of the AAFA RAP guidance to understand and eradicate forced labor. To be clear, what this document is a thought framework for addressing the issue. This is not something that can be readily and easily encapsulated to a pithy solution or to any kind of specific, set of actions. It is a very broad, very nuanced, very challenging issue. And what we're trying to present is a methodology within which to think about it and tackle it in ways that are going to be effective for your organization. The document is going to be focused on the legal and practical aspects of managing the supply chain. It goes without saying that the moral issue really is at the heart of this, and nobody at all is ever going to have anything other than absolute certainty about the undesirability of forced labor in the supply chain. So the moral issue is obvious, and you don't need me or Nate or Mark to talk about that. How it presents itself in the supply chain and how the practical challenges of dealing with it are manifesting is where the challenge lies, and as such, this webinar and the document underlying it will focus on that legal and practical aspect. It's really more about making sure you as an organization are armed with the right set of questions to be asking of yourselves and of your suppliers in order to best position your company to handle the situation as it arises in your context. Then it is about supplying specific answers to those questions. As we all know, this is a very nuanced and difficult topic, and each organization is very uniquely placed in how it is dealing with it, how it is challenged by it. So the document and this webinar is meant not to provide a silver bullet, because there simply aren't any, but to provide that thought framework within which to have an effective system in place. A few things to point out that this webinar and the AAFA RAP guidance is not. And the first thing to bring to your attention is that it's not focused on any specific geography or any particular example of forced labor. At any point in time, there may be an issue or two, and we know which one is on top of our minds right now, but this guidance is meant to be about forced labor writ large. Naturally, specific contexts will come up and examples will be provided, and the document is rich with such material, but it is meant to be an overall guidance on forced labor writ large, and not addressing specific geographies or specific issues or instances. The other thing it's not, of course, probably goes without saying, but it is worth saying, is it's not legal advice. This document presents a thought framework and some best practices and recommendations and resources, but of course it is no substitute for you to contact your own attorneys if there are specific cases that you're involved with that need particular action to be taken. And finally, in that regard, this document and this webinar is not a recommendation for any kind of collective action. Each individual company is going to be uniquely situated, as I've said already, and they will have to make decisions that make the most sense for them in their setting. And this document is meant to help guide that process. So with that as background, let me invite my colleague Mark to begin the deep dive into the discussion and talk to us a little bit about the definitions and the laws that apply with forced labor and where you might find it in your supply chain. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Audits. So to better understand forced labor, a good place to start is a definition and a legal framework. Title 19 of the U.S. Code covers all things related to customs and duties. It includes Section 1307 that addresses forced labor and provides that all goods made in whole or in part with forced labor are prohibited entry at any port of the United States. And forced labor, as you can see in the definition here, is defined as involuntary work under threat of a penalty. So the prohibition of goods made with forced labor originated in the Tariff Act of 1930. This is also referred to as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. And the primary thrust of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was duties and protecting U.S. industries from foreign competition. In fact, Smoot-Hawley in 1930 raised the average duty rate on over 20,000 goods from 40 to 60%. And for those of you with an interest in trade and duties and indeed forced labor, reviewing and researching a few wiki articles on Smoot-Hawley and its impacts and effects would be advisable. But in addition to looking at duties, the Tariff Act of 1930 also addressed convict and forced labor. That's the language we see today. But it wasn't from humanitarian grounds or moral outrage. It was a concern that such labor would give foreign manufacturers a competitive advantage in the United States. And so it was prohibited. But importantly, that Tariff Act of 1930 also included an exception that really swallowed the rule. And it provided in Section 307 that goods that were made with forced labor or convict labor could still come into the United States to meet U.S. demand if it wasn't already being met by U.S. production. This is referred to as the consumptive demand exception. And this exception basically neutered the prohibition on forced goods and convict labor goods coming into the United States. So what happened? What happened in 2016 was President Obama signed the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, TIF-TIA. And this act removed the consumptive demand exception. And very quickly, the original intent of the Tariff Act of 1930 prohibiting forced labor and convict labor was enabled. And U.S. Customs was strengthened and had capabilities to block the import of goods made with forced labor. And just to give you some perspective, just since October 1 of 2020, CBP has already detained 371 shipments through the period of March 31, 2021. Now, contrast that to the 86 years that the Tariff Act of 1930 was in place with that exception that I mentioned. In that period, only 41 detentions under Section 307 were made. So it's complete reversal, and we are dealing now with a very powerful statute that prohibits the importation of goods made with forced labor or convict labor. And as I was doing a little bit of research on the CBP site, which really is an excellent guide and has a wide set of materials for importers, I came across this quote, which I just wanted to share. CBP is a global leader in leveraging customs and border authorities to address forced labor in supply chains. So not only is CBP the point of the spear for United States enforcement against forced labor, it's also leading other customs authorities around the world to do the same. This sounds to me like a mission statement, and it sounds like this problem is not going away, that we're going to see more detentions and more action and more coordinated action across jurisdictions. Next slide, please, Abadis. So it's not just U.S. Customs and the Tariff Act of 1930 that plays a role in identifying and rooting out forced labor in supply chains. An important organization that also provides guidance and direction in this area is the International Labor Organization. Just by background, the ILO was formed at the end of World War I in 1919 and was part of the then League of Nations. It later, the League of Nations was folded into the United Nations in 1946, but through that whole time, the ILO continued to take steps to advance humanitarian values in the workplace with a particular focus on forced labor. And in fact, in 1930, the same year that the Tariff Act was passed, the ILO adopted Convention number 29 on forced labor, and it noted, each member of the International Labor Organization which ratifies this convention undertakes to suppress the use of forced or compulsory labor in all its forms within the shortest possible period. And over this time period from 1930 till today, the ILO has continued to provide guidance, direction, and initiatives through its membership. And it has a unique tripartite membership, and another webinar will go into maybe some of that background. But it has also provided us 11 indicators of forced labor, and these are on the screen. I'm not going to go through each of these today, but we will talk about some of them as we advance the slides and move forward with the presentation. But these come from the ILO, and interestingly, the U.S. has not ratified Convention number 29 on forced labor for different reasons, but it does look to the ILO and for guidance and is influenced by its work. And in fact, if you go to the CBP site, you'll see that these indicators of forced labor are provided as a guide to suppliers and importers. Also, I would expect that most companies on the call here today not only have a code of conduct in terms of what they expect from their suppliers, but in that code of conduct, they have a prohibition on forced labor. That would come from the ILO Convention number 29. Next slide. So it's not just the Tariff Act of 1930 or the ILO that play a role in identifying and rooting out forced labor in supply chains. There are other laws in other jurisdictions that are taking or have taken action. For example, the California Supply Chain Transparency Act passed, I believe that was 2012, along with two other provisions, the UK Modern Slavery Act and the Australia Modern Slavery Act, all take a point of view that companies have to publicize the steps that they're taking to identify and root out forced labor in their supply chains. So reporting obligations. Canada is also considering a modern slavery act with reporting obligations and penalties for not reporting. And another source of law that is looked to in the United States, Canada, and Mexico is the new NAFTA, the USMCA. It has enhanced labor provisions which prohibit the signers from importing goods made with forced labor. And perhaps even more importantly here in this space around forced labor is what's going on in Europe. And here we're on the cusp of seeing the EU move towards mandatory human rights due diligence. And in this situation, it's not just reporting the steps you're taking, but it's documenting steps that have been taken within your supply chain to identify and remediate forced labor under penalty. And this seems to be the direction that these laws are moving towards. Next slide, please, Audits. A minute and talk a little bit about where you might find forced labor in your supply chain. It can appear at any point. It can appear from the raw material all the way to the finished goods. But there are a couple categories or areas that are higher vulnerability for forced labor to appear. One deals with migrant workers, folks that are moving within a country from maybe the countryside to the city and are staying in a hostel and are in effectively a foreign space. And also folks that are moving between countries. What you see in this situation is intermediaries, brokers, job finders are asking for fees, demanding fees, sometimes high fees, advancing travel costs, and then having high interest rates on the repayment, putting the worker in debt to the point where they can't afford or can't leave the job. This would be an indicator of forced labor and a concern. Another issue with migrant labor is when they're housed on a facility for work, do they have the ability to leave? And restrictions could be related to safety, or they could be related to not permitting people to travel or leave their employment. And that requires a careful review of the overall circumstances of the employment and house-filling situation. And then one other group I wanted to mention is workers that are involved in the raw material production. So in some states, raw material production is a critical source of foreign currency. And for the harvest, they'll mobilize labor of all sorts. And that could be a forced condition. It could include child labor. And so in this space, for example, we've seen over the years the challenge with Uzbekistan cotton picking and the forced labor and child labor concerns and the steps that were taken to address and remediate that. So these are two areas in the supply chain that are particularly vulnerable for forced labor. So I hope that in these last couple slides, we've been able to provide a high-level set of definitions and a legal framework. And now we can move forward with some of the other material and topics. Audits?
All right. Thank you, Mark. So with that as background, let's talk about addressing forced labor. And as I've mentioned already, we'll look at it from a policy perspective as well as a practice perspective. As you heard Mark mention, we expect most of the folks listening are already in possession of a code of conduct and are expressly prohibiting forced labor, and that's really the minimum, absolute minimum requirement. Your company needs to have a policy making clear that they do not tolerate forced labor in their supply chain. This is not something that you can stay silent on or something that you can simply, not attend to. So it is going to be absolutely necessary to have it be expressly dealt with. It will be up to individual companies to decide what exactly they will say and what level of detail they will go into. It's up to their sort of degree of comfort and their own approach to managing their supply chains and how they engage with their stakeholders. But the notion that you can stay on the sidelines is not an option. You have to expressly address it. When you are doing that, if you're one of the folks that maybe hasn't given this as much attention as it needs, then there are some things to consider with regards to how you communicate and what you communicate. And it starts by that very question, what are you going to include in that policy? I mean, the basic idea that you don't tolerate forced labor is, of course, the given here. But what does that mean? What does that result in? And so you could consider definitions. You've heard a couple from the 19 USC 1307 to the ILO definition and others that are all sort of in that same vein. Are you going to be that expressive? Are you going to identify what are the prohibited actions that you want to call out? Are there specifics that you want to address in that regard? Will your policy go so far as to say what happens if you find a partner violating the policy? Will you be including the consequences? Will you be including the actions you will be taking if your policy is violated? All things to consider and determine what your comfort level is with that degree of detail. Another important question is, where is that policy going to reside? Where will you publish it? In your organization, where is it housed? Who is responsible for it? Is it part of legal? Is it part of sourcing? Is it part of, who is the person or the office that deals with it? And physically, for want of a better way of putting it, where does this document, this policy reside? Is it in the vendor code? Is it a separate document that stands alone? Is it something that's included as a matter of course in other kind of correspondence? All of these are details that need attention because they do speak to how widespread and how effective the dissemination will be, and at the same time also speak to the audiences you want to reach, and also others who might have access to it that you would be wise to be aware of and take into account how you might want to position yourself with regards to openness and engagement levels. So things to consider. And then the final piece of that exercise is, how are you going to convey this policy? Not simply physically, you're sending an email or including it on your website or in the vendor code, but is there going to be a public element to it? Is this going to be something on the public-facing website? Are you going to engage in a series of training exercises for internal staff, for your supply chain? Will that be part of the requirements you impose when it comes to establishing new relationships? And of course, all of this sort of splits into what are you doing internally, training for your own team, for example, and your own staff, and what are you doing externally, talking to the vendor base, talking to other stakeholders, communicating and expressing your position with regards to your policy on forced labor. All issues to consider, and it's important to give it all collective thought because they all interrelate to each other. Where you house it and where you publish it obviously has direct impacts to how you convey it, and then it all boils down to what exactly are you saying and what exactly are you requiring. What is the comfort level that your organization is going to be able to be effective with when it comes to this issue. One alternative, or even for that matter, a supplement to consider in this regard for organizations that have their own code or want to address this issue more broadly, is in addition to that own policy, committing your supply chain, requiring of your vendor base that they participate in independent programs that exist out there and address this issue and do so in sort of a rigorous manner and are designed to conduct effective social audits and to certify that the facilities you are engaging with are indeed meeting those requirements, meeting these policies, and therefore in compliance with your own policy. Naturally, this is an area that RAP can be of direct help with, and we're happy to discuss that further. But this is not about pitching RAP. It is about the point that it is good for your organization to have that independent validation, and it could be some other organization that's out there doing effective work as well. So keep that option in mind as an alternative, or certainly as a supplement for an own in-house policy. The reason why this is an important point to call out is whatever your approach may be to this issue, it is going to be critical that it be deemed as a credible approach from outside stakeholders that you will inevitably have to engage with when dealing with the challenge of forced labor in your supply chain. And therefore, whatever it is you're doing, you have a policy, but if you're not being particularly open about it, if nobody can find it, it's going to be hard to consider that a credible policy. But if they can, and yet you're finding instances in your own supply chain of violations that you don't seem to be addressing in their eyes, then that is a credibility challenge. So that outside connection, that independent assessment, having the supply chain be validated by a third-party certification program will add to the credibility of the policy that you are espousing as an organization. Independence being the key, and accountability, right? This is what folks are going to be looking for. This is what you're going to be challenged on if you're not doing an adequate job in the eyes of the folks that are paying close attention to this. And all of that ultimately speaks to the credibility of your approach. Okay, that's on the policy side and sort of the theoretical, intellectual lift that has to happen and has to be done properly to have a credible approach to forced labor. What about practice? In the end, policy is good, but it's going to amount to little if you're not seen as acting on that policy. And the question really on the practical side is, what steps do you take as an organization to identify and root out forced labor in your supply chain? What are you doing as you operate these supply chains across the globe to make sure that you're not party to these violations? And if you do encounter it, how do you address it? How do you remediate it? It begins naturally with a good risk mitigation mentality. You want to make sure that you understand where you are with regards to risk areas and analyze your supply chain for levels of variation in risk of forced labor. You heard from Mark a couple of indicators that are suggestive of especially vulnerable populations, migrant workers or workers in the raw material industry. Where does your supply chain fit with regards to that? Are you in a country where you see a lot of migrant workers in the general work populace, your risk there being higher, or are you in a country that you tend not to have that, and so your risk might be slightly lower? There are all kinds of resources available for this risk mitigation general exercise, both public from various government publications, including from our own state and labor departments, as well as private resources. Plenty of organizations provide risk assessment services. And we list a few examples and link to some resources in the guidance document that AFA and RAP have just published. A very important part of this general risk mitigation and sort of overall management of your supply chain is the assurance that regular social compliance audits are conducted at the facilities that you're engaging with, because that is your way of touching that supply chain on a regular basis and keeping an eye on developments and monitoring it for changes in ground realities. And ultimately, generalized risk assessments, however useful and important they are not going to be enough, because if there is going to be a problem, it will be at a specific facility in a specific instance. So you might be in a country that is otherwise low risk, but you might have a particular factory in your supply chain that does have some other indicators and does present a risk to you. So the need to have regular social compliance audits is going to be very important. And of course, it goes without saying that you want to make sure that these audits do specifically address forced labor. It is not simply a general assessment of health and safety at the factory, for example. You are going to want to make sure that the audits, whether you do your own or as recommended, using independent, credible third parties, are addressing this specific issue head on. That's the question, and in some sense, there's going to be, again, individualized decision making to determine what your comfort level is, but we've talked about the factors that ought to be part of that discussion. One important point to make here is that social audits have historically in our space been focused, not limited, but focused on the first tier. And that, of course, is a given, no question there. But as you heard, forced labor as a risk is not limited just to the first tier. It could show up anywhere in the supply chain. And you want, as you tackle this issue, to protect yourself as much as possible across your supply chain. So ask yourself, are you doing enough social audits beyond tier 1, in tier 2, and even further upstream, all the way up to cotton fields, as you've heard, as one other area of risk for forced labor. So in addition to individual actions that you're taking as an organization and your own audit protocol or engaging with independent certification programs, ask yourself, do you participate in initiatives that proactively work to root out forced labor in a collective way, whether it is things like the AAFA's responsible recruitment pledge and other parties that are connected with that, or other groups that are addressing responsible recruitment or other forced labor initiatives. What is your organizational appetite and an ability to engage in those groups, both for learning purposes and also as a way of making sure that you protect yourself as an organization when it comes to identifying and mitigating against forced labor risks in your supply chain. Very important and increasing in importance now, especially with the latest round of attention that the CBP is paying to this, and you heard Mark mention the high number of detentions under Section 1307, is are you able to have better visibility into your supply chain all the way back to the raw material level? Because so much of this Customs and Border Protection's withhold release orders are being triggered not by first tier violations, but by issues further upstream. And so do you have traceability and transparency in your supply chain? Are you able to have a degree of confidence that you know where the cotton that has gone into the raw material that you use to make your t-shirts came from? Can you validate that? Can you prove it? Can you show it to an independent person in a way that would be credible and verifiable? This is where some cutting edge technology is coming into play. So are you exploring, are you utilizing, if there are solutions available that suit your needs, technologies or other initiatives out there that are focused on traceability and provide you with additional insight into what's going on further upstream in your supply chain, and thereby greater insight into potential forced labor issues that you might be encountering? All important questions to think about on the practical side. But really, one issue that you have to grapple with is the tough one. What happens if you do find forced labor? When you have that warning, and you actually got a report where you've got reason to believe that you're going to be in a position where you've got a situation. And it's important to think about this in advance, because if you're crossed, you're likely going to be in a rather tight turnaround time frame. And so this is where things like this guidance document should hopefully provide help, even to those of you that have plenty of experience in the field, in giving you that pre-match analysis, so to speak. Don't wait for there to be a problem. Think about things. Think about whether this is something that you call out as a zero tolerance issue. Is this the kind of thing that, were you to encounter, you would immediately sever your ties with the organization and say, we simply cannot tolerate this, and then walk away? Is that something that you have the appetite to do? Is that something you think would be acceptable to your stakeholders writ large? Or is this the kind of thing that you might consider attempting remediation? Can you address it in a way that is effective? Is this something you're willing to take on? Because that would be a larger and obviously more complicated question. Does it depend on circumstances? Are you going to present a more nuanced policy that gives you sort of a range of options, and say to yourself, to make a determination on a case-by-case basis whether or not remediation is an option, or whether it's simply going to have to be something we're going to have to walk away from? So all of these things are worth considering ahead of time, as I said, so you're better placed to deal with a situation should one present itself to you. And then another set of questions that you are likely going to want to think about in advance is, what, if any, information about these kinds of situations are you going to be willing to share publicly? If these things come to light, and they come to light in a private setting through an audit, are you going to make that information generally known? If it is a forced labor issue and you're dealing with a shipment inbound that you have reason to believe was tainted by that, are you going to contact the relevant regulators? Is that something that you countenance as part of your philosophy, as part of your policy with dealing with these issues? All difficult questions, no doubt, but questions that are going to be worth addressing up front. And that last one in particular, as we look at handling of allegations, and especially at withhold release orders from the CBP, is obviously not theoretic. We're seeing it happen in real time right now. And so we've got a few pieces of information to share about that as well. And for that, I'll invite Nate back onto the screen to walk us through a couple of slides on handling allegations of forced labor in your supply chain.
Thanks, Avidis. So could you go back one slide, I think? Yeah, Avidis, yeah, I'm sorry. One more slide, and there we go. Okay, so we talked about finding, Avidis talked in detail about if in your own due diligence you find possible evidence of forced labor, and how do you address it? Regrettably, as Avidis noted and Mark noted, those are not the only sources from where forced labor allegations can come from as it relates to your supply chain. They can come from the press or NGOs, and they can come from government regulators. And so, again, the issues that you need to ask yourself now before you're in that situation is, how do you respond? Do you have a plan? Do you cooperate? Do you investigate? Do you respond publicly? And who do you share your findings with? So these are all critical issues. We've worked with some of you in certain cases where there's been allegations brought to the fore by an NGO or by the press. And these are issues that you do need to take seriously, because it is a reputation issue for you. And as I always say, 20 years of building a reputation can be destroyed in 20 tweets. And so you want to make sure that you have a plan on how to deal with it, because you should deal with it. In most cases, you can't ignore the allegations. You're going to have to respond in some way. So that's dealing with the press or with NGO allegations. But what happens when you're dealing with regulators, particularly withhold release orders issued by U.S. Customs and Border Protection? As Mark noted, since October 1st, there's been 371 withhold release orders. From what we've been told, the overwhelming bulk of those withhold release orders, over 300 of them, detentions under withhold release orders, shipments detained, over 300 of those shipments detained have been related to the 2 withhold release orders affecting our industry as it relates to Xinjiang. The blanket WRO on cotton products from Xinjiang, and the WRO on XPCC and its related affiliates. So what do you need to do? As Mark noted, a WRO can be triggered at any stage of the production. It can be dealing with raw materials, as in this case, cotton. It can be dealing with finished products, which also is the same WRO. Even though it's dealing with raw materials, any finished product that contains those raw materials can be blocked from being imported by customs. And so it really is at any stage in production. And that's why, as Avidis noted, you really need to have transparency and traceability in your supply chain. The way a withhold release order works is the entire burden is on the importer if they have a shipment detained under a WRO. That means you're basically guilty until proven innocent. It turns US jurisprudence on its head. So you have to basically, customs makes an allegation, and if you want your shipment released, you have to prove that they're wrong. And you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they're wrong. So, and we'll talk on the next slide a little bit about what kind of information you need, but you need to figure out now, before you're subject to one of these detentions, how will you meet this burden? If you're not able to today, when? how can you be running test scenarios with certain parts of your supply chain? How do you determine the highest risk parts of your supply chain so that you can run these test scenarios on those high risk parts and focus on that first? And also, you need to be thinking about, well, if there are these WROs out there, even if I haven't had any shipments detained yet under them, should I be looking at alternatives here? Should I be looking at alternative sourcing options? Should I be looking also, if I have a shipment detained, should I be looking at maybe not fighting the detention? Maybe I should be looking at re-exporting the product out of the United States and what's involved with that. So next slide. So what if you decide to contest a detention? As we've learned very clearly from the WROs on Xinjiang, is that U.S. Customs and Border Protection expects verified documentation all the way back to the raw material level. Basically, for each invoice or purchase order in the detained shipment, you need to have, for example, the country of origin for the raw cotton. You need to have the purchase orders, the invoices, the shipping documents, the production documents to show that that cotton indeed was then sold to the cotton trader and then to the yarn spinner and then to the fabric, and then the yarn spinner used it, sold that yarn to the fabric mill. The fabric mill then used that yarn to make the fabric. The fabric was then used by the final manufacturer to make the final product, and that manufacturer did indeed ship the final product to the importer. So you need a lot of documents. Those documents all need to be submitted to Customs electronically and translated fully into English. Now, Customs says, well, if you can just translate part, but if we want more information, you're going to have to translate the whole thing. And so the rule of thumb would be probably best to translate the entire documents, all the documents into English in their entirety. But just as important, as we've learned over the last few weeks, is that not only do you give them this sort of data dump of all the documents showing this process, you need to present a narrative or a timeline or a roadmap or a flow chart that clearly demonstrates how those documents prove your story, that the product in this case was not made with cotton from Xinjiang and was not made by any affiliates of XPCC. So you have to go through a number of steps. And so you need this narrative up front so that ties all those documents together. But even in those cases, there are no, if you were able to provide all the information, there are no guarantees. So what happens if your petition to lift a detention is denied? You can contest detention with something called an exclusionary protest. Just to note on that, is if you do that, it is the same people at U.S. Customs and Border Protection that are reviewing the case that initially denied your petition. However, with an exclusionary protest, you can provide new information. And so that might shift the balance and shift the decision in your favor. And worst case scenario, if the protest is denied, you can take Customs to court. And we're actually seeing the first case of a WRO, of a detention, shipment detained, being taken to court. And it's related to palm oil, which is a separate case where CBP has issued a withhold release order on a raw material that's used in hundreds of different types of products. But also, again, you have alternatives to contesting a detention. You do have the option to re-export the product to another country, but obviously that has its own set of issues. You need to consider the import regulations in that country, labeling, product safety, product standards, and there might be other costs, new tariffs in that new country, reshipping costs, and other issues. And we go into this in detail in the guidance, and as you know, we've also put out other separate guidance as it relates to the Xinjiang WROs. So we recommend you look at the guidance and read it in detail to get some of that information. I'll turn it back over to you, Audits.
Great. Thank you, Nate. That's a lot of material, and I want to save some time for questions. But just to conclude, it just goes without saying, forced labor is not to be tolerated in supply chains. There's no two ways about it. We all have a moral obligation to fight this, and there's also the legal obligation to take all reasonable steps we can to identify and eliminate all forms of forced labor in the supply chain. But as you all know from experience, and as the foregoing 47 minutes made clear, this is a very challenging issue. No easy answers, a lot of nuances to it, and it is therefore going to be very critical for each of you, each individual organization, to develop a company-specific approach and prepare a plan that addresses this topic in a way that suits your needs and your place where you are in the journey when it comes to supply chain management in your case. What we hope that this webinar has helped you with, and what the AAFA wrap guidance to understand and eradicate forced labor is meant for, is to be used as a thought framework, as I mentioned already, and to help you identify some best practices and resources in order to assist in that process of developing a company-specific approach. Thank you for your attention. We look forward to your questions. I'll invite my colleagues back on here and turn it over to you, Nate, to moderate us through the Q&A.
Thanks, Avidis, and thanks, Mark. We'll go ahead and take some time for questions now. As a reminder, please be sure to type your questions in the question box in your control panel. We'll address as many questions as possible, and we will respond via email to any unanswered questions after the webinar. Okay, so sorry, let me open up the question box here. Sorry, okay. A few questions have come in. Hold on. Okay. Okay, are there credible mechanisms to trace cotton back to the farm? Can we know with 100% certainty that our products do not contain cotton from Uzbekistan or Xinjiang? What are the best ways to protect against blends or contamination of raw materials once they become yarns and fabrics?
Why don't you start off with a softball, Nate? I'll say a couple of things, and then I know, Nate, you might have some, and Mark, you might have some input to add to this as well. It's not impossible to be 100% certain, but that's a very, very narrow limit to knowing for a fact that you can point to a particular manufacturer. If you know you get all your cotton from the U.S. and you're able to prove it, and there's no cotton exchange center involved. I mean, it is a fungible product. So if you're not using anything very complicated, you have a very simple, traceable approach, perhaps you can make the case. But it's very, very difficult. There are some technologies that are coming up that talk about tracing cotton DNA and other methodologies that will hopefully get us to where the degree of confidence will be higher than it is now. But the reality is it's a fungible product, and unless you're able to really connect the dots all the way back to the farm, you're going to be hard pressed to make that claim in a way that can't be contested. So I'll leave it there. Mark, Nate, if you want to build on that.
Yeah, I might add, thanks, Avidis. As we see some of the appeal decisions publicized, we begin to see how challenging it is to provide the documentation that's necessary to meet the standard. And this is partly why we included in the guidelines pragmatic business advice, frankly, on what you need to decide ahead of time you're able to establish with evidence. And if you don't think you can meet that burden, perhaps make the call to re-export the goods earlier and have a market and a place to sell those in mind ahead of time. That might help you deal with the particular entry, but it doesn't help you deal with your supply chain and your factory. That's a bigger question that requires discussion with your sourcing team and your sourcing strategy.
Yeah, and just to add and sort of get at another question that was asked by the audience, there are traceability technologies that are being looked at by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. They actually did do a pilot with one firm, and we expect that pilot to be expanded shortly. So there are technologies out there. There are concerns with some of the technologies not being able to find the origin in every single circumstance, but there is some work being done. But CBP has been very unclear how that would play into any decisions they would make to lift a detention, regrettably. Okay, so moving on to other questions. Has CBP required companies to provide third-party audit reports for each of the suppliers within the supply chain involved in a shipment that has been detained? I guess I'll take that one. In most cases, yes, they would be U.S. Customs and Border Protection. If you were detained under a withhold release order, they would be asking for those audits. And those audits, what they would be looking for is for them to prove that your shipment did not meet any of the 11 ILO forced labor indicators that Mark referred to earlier. However, in the case of the blanket WRO covering any product that contains, excuse me, cotton or cotton products from Xinjiang, the dynamic is a little different. Basically, the assumption that Customs has made is that any product that contains cotton or cotton products from Xinjiang is by definition made with forced labor. And so what you're trying to prove is that you did not use cotton or cotton products from Xinjiang. And so that's the whole point of that. And so in that particular case, you do not need to provide social audits because they don't help prove the point that the cotton was not from Xinjiang and that cotton that was not from Xinjiang was used in the final product. It depends on the circumstance. But for most other withhold release orders, you're trying to prove with social audits that you're not meeting any of the 11 forced labor indicators. Okay, so.
In fact, Nate, to build on that, the challenging dynamic aside, as a general matter, Customs does actually encourage regular audits as part of your supply chain due diligence in their own documentation. And Mark, this was an area you covered, the laws in CBP. If you want to add anything to that regard, as a general practice, it's something that would be encouraged. Even if
again, the CBP site is pretty helpful in terms of tools of what they expect, and there is guidance provided, and that guidance includes regular audits of your supply chain to demonstrate there's no forced labor or forced labor indicators in your supply chain. And at Tier 1, this also happens, of course, outside of China. There's CATSA, there's other areas. Really, any presence of forced labor, you would benefit from having a social audit that you could submit to show your diligence.
Okay, next question. Any updates on auditing in Xinjiang itself? Last year, several auditing firms left. Are they back?
That's an easy one. Unfortunately, no. The reason some folks pulled out had to do with the fact that conditions on the ground made it impossible to have independent audits. You need permission to fly in. They know you're coming. They insist on accompanying you. And there have been other violations so extreme as individual auditors being threatened. And so none of that has changed on the ground, sadly. And so the organizations that who felt that we can't do credible audits in Xinjiang continue to feel that way. Hopefully that will change, and hopefully we will be able to return to where we can do audits to the standards that they need to be held at. But for the moment, the answer is still no.
Okay, good question here. Involuntary overtime is very common in apparel manufacturing. At what point does involuntary overtime become forced labor?
That is a good question, a very difficult one. It's not a matter of semantics. I mean, I wonder what the person who asked the question really meant by involuntary. If by definition the individual did not want to work those hours and was being forced to work them, then that is forced labor. If by involuntary you simply mean that it's part of the contract, you don't have a choice whether or not you can do overtime or not. If you want the job, it comes with overtime. Then there is this sense of you're being given advanced notification, and as long as those hours are within what the law allows, you're probably not going to be running afoul of forced labor challenges. So the question becomes, what does voluntary or involuntary in this context mean? If it's just simply this is part of the job, essentially take it or leave it ahead of time, up front, that's one thing. If it's we're shutting the doors, you can't leave until you finish this work, that's something else altogether. So a good question, and we'll need the specifics to make the decision as to whether or not the forced labor line is being crossed.
Okay. Do you know what documents are going to be used in the palm oil court case that will help win the case? That's a good question. Obviously, they feel they have a case and that they feel that the detention was unjustified and the exclusion of that shipment from the United States was unjustified. So I assume they're going to provide audits and other documentation to either prove that that the product was not made with forced labor, again, those 11 ILO forced labor indicators, or that the shipment actually was not from the palm oil plantation that CBP targeted with their WRO. Palm oil, like cotton, is a very fungible commodity and comes from hundreds of plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia and elsewhere, and can be easily mixed together by brokers, similar to what happens with cotton. So that's a good question. Okay, so should it be a concern to U.S. companies that their compliance with CBP and other U.S. regulations may result in retaliations by the Chinese government? Any suggestions?
Another tough one. This is obviously happening, and we've seen how powerful the retaliation can be. We've seen examples of it from other events before. Going back to the NBA and the pain they felt in China over one manager's tweet in support of the Hong Kong protests. So the geopolitical realities are out there and cannot be ignored. One suggestion, one thing this brings to the front is that this issue at center here is not a supply chain issue per se. These allegations involve state actors and state sponsors. And so the idea that you can point to industry and say, go make it right, is not realistic because it cannot be resolved simply with supply chain actors taking supply chain actions. So the sort of suggestion here is that we engage through organizations like the AAFA to lobby our governments and others around to make this be a government-to-government conversation to actually address the root cause, because it's not going to be something that the industry can solve simply by taking supply chain actions.
And I would add to that, Abadis, it also is incumbent on companies to try to take a forward view of where this is going. As the pressure builds in the U.S. and in other countries taking retaliatory action, what are the possible endgame scenarios, and how will that impact your ability to source from a given country? This is just part of the overall risk assessment that you go through in deciding where to place your supply chain and how much to place in a certain or other countries.
Regrettably, we've run out of time. We've hit the top of the hour. So we do have a few more questions, and we'll follow up with those offline. But I like to note, if we move to the next slide, that the AFA wrap guidance is now live. And so if you click on that link, you can access the guidance. Note that it is member-only guidance. You can please reach out to me if you're not a member and wanted to talk about that. But the guidance is now live and available on the AFA website for AAFA members. And then finally, before we end, I'd like to encourage folks to sign up for our annual Global Supply Chain and Trade Conference that'll be taking place next week, May 25th and 26th. We'll be talking about a lot of supply chain issues, including forced labor, and we will actually have Anna Hinojosa, who's the Executive Director for Trade Enforcement at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, as one of our speakers. And so there's still time for register to that. You can register at the link on the screen or register on the events page on the AAFA website. And then finally, I just want to thank our speakers, Audits and Mark,